I'm Adam F.C. Fletcher, and I'm here to talk about meaningful student involvement. Across the United States and around the world, there is a movement that is transforming education from the inside out. It takes the best practices that we know and understand already, whether that's action-based learning, whether that is student-driven learning, whether that is student-adult partnerships, and it transforms the entirety of the education system to embrace and lift up those possibilities, not just for some students in some schools, but for every student in every school all of the time. Meaningful student involvement empowers student voice to become the engine for student engagement in order to transform education, communities, and democracy. It does this by taking students and moving them from being the passive recipients of adult-driven education systems to making them active partners in learning, teaching, and leadership. It happens in 6 primary ways. The first way that it happens is, and of course, the only way that it happens is through learning. Learning becomes the main function, not just of the classroom, but in the actual administration, operation, and systemization of education at the classroom level, at the school office, in the hallways, throughout extracurriculars, but also at the principal's office, in the district offices, at the state level, and beyond. I'm talking about students becoming involved as partners in education planning so that they're helping to select, identify, and otherwise lift up curriculum, teacher hiring, and other forms of planning. Students becoming involved in education research so that they are actively planning research, conducting research, looking at the data, assessing the outcomes. Students as teachers actively leading classrooms, not just peer-to-peer teaching, but actually leading classrooms for their peers, for younger students, for older students, but also for adults, particularly for teachers in training, for parents, so that students can teach and train and share their knowledge. Students as evaluators, so they can look at what they've done, what they've learned, but also look at the structures of education. Are they serving students best? Look at teacher performance. How can it be improved? Look at the building's climate and culture to help identify ways to lift it up. Students as decision makers. This is happening in so many ways where students are not only constructing the decisions that matter to them individually, but actually helping to form the decisions that happen on the building level, whether that is choosing the rules that students follow and the ways that they follow them through a lot of different avenues, whether they're interacting on the district level as members of the school board or in an advisory board for the school board. In Boston, there's a student advisory council that's been working with the school board for more than 20 years to advise the school board on how to operate. Those students have actually written policies, enacted policies, reformed policies, and transformed schools through the Boston Student Advisory Council. Finally, students as advocates, standing up not only for their own interests, but for the interests of their community, for their school, and beyond. Again, in the local classroom, in the building level, in the district level, in the state level, and beyond. This is happening in so many ways and in so many places. It's happening on the personal level so that students are improving their own learning by becoming active partners throughout the education system. It's happening on the international level where there are students who are partaking in international conferences, international collaborations, in cross-border collaborations between schools and different avenues all around the world. There are students who belong to a school in Brazil called the Tree School, and the Tree School is happening outside of Raycliffe, Brazil. It's a beautiful environment where students are actually partnering with adults to administer their school, to lead their school. But they're doing it in a way that's focused on authenticity and genuine community need. So students actually help to identify the curriculum, build the teaching method that the curriculum is going to be delivered through, and then deliver the curriculum, not only to themselves, but to their elders and to younger students as well. What makes this school particularly fascinating is that not only is the tree school happening in Raycliffe, Brazil, it's happening in Palestine as well, in the refugee camps there, in the same model, in the same fashion. And students are collaborating across those borders transnationally in order to experience meaningful student involvement around the world. Australia, South Africa, China, Nigeria, Britain, Canada, the United States. The examples come pouring in from around the world, and in so many ways. This movement towards meaningful student involvement is happening on the national level, whether we're talking about students partaking in education policy making in the UK, if we're talking about the Iridium project across Europe that has students moving into partnership roles in schools, so that rather than school being done to them, it's being done with them in this way that I'm describing. And it's also happening on the hyper local level, so that in Portland, Oregon, students are involved in improving the transportation system, because without school busing, they have to get to school still. And so they use the public transit instead of paying for it out of their own pocket. Because of student advocacy in the last 20 years, the school district is actually supplementing that cost of student transportation, and students are taking that public transit with those public dollars that were advocated for by students themselves. So in these ways, education is beginning to get flipped, not just in the nice way of flipping the classroom, but entirely flipping the entire education system. Not so that students run it, but that students and adults can work in partnership. It happens in 5 main ways that I've found that I call the cycle of engagement. This cycle of engagement has meaningful student involvement happening through listening to students. Now, a lot of adults, when you talk about listening to students, they think that's the beginning and the end of student engagement. But what meaningful student involvement has shown us is that listening to students, particularly to student voice, is the first way to foster meaningful student involvement, but not the only one. The second way to foster meaningful student involvement is by validating students. Students need to know that adults are listening, that they're hearing them. And the way to let students know is by saying, hey, I hear you, simply acknowledging them. Sometimes it means disagreeing with students and letting students know there's other ways to think about it. Sometimes it means agreeing with students and saying, hey, I hear what you're saying. Let's do this and make it happen. Another way is by simply asking more questions and inquiring and really digging into the possibilities. So listening, validating. The third step in the cycle of engagement is authorizing. What I have found when I researched meaningful student involvement over the last 20 years, authority becomes a main issue over and over. And that's because students generally don't have the opportunity to use the core of that word, authorizing, the core of that word being author. They don't get the opportunity to tell their own stories. And so what we do in meaningful student involvement is position students and educate them to be able to tell their own stories. Once they gain that authority, they move into the fourth step of the cycle of engagement, which is action. Action, moving, doing, transforming, changing, evolving. This is at the heart of meaningful student involvement because it takes those words and it makes them into motion. But that's not all, because in order for it to be a cycle, it has to reconnect. It reconnects through this fifth step of reflection. And that reflection process really looks back and says to the learner, to the adult partner, what is it that we did? Why did we do that? And what effect did it have? And what do we do with what we learned? And then it applies that process of reflection and the lessons from reflection back to listening again. So that 5-step process in the cycle of engagement, listen, validate, authorize, act, reflect, becomes the heart of meaningful student involvement. Students in these new empowered roles become meaningful partners with adults, again, all across the education system. What this does in turn is, instead of overly engaging particular groups of students in leadership opportunities, it transforms the learning and teaching process so that every learner can have a role, because there's so many decisions, there's so much research, there's so many evaluations, there's so much teaching, there's so many opportunities for advocacy, and there's so much planning that happens all throughout schools all the time on every level, that we have an almost infinite number of opportunities for students to become meaningfully involved. Now, that question of what makes it meaningful is at the core of all of this, because that meaningful involvement, that holds the best engagement theory that we know about. That holds the best motivational theories that we know about. But more importantly, that holds democracy at the heart of it, because it engages every learner not as a passive recipient, but as an active partner in countless and endless ways, all throughout the entire education system, from the beginning of their experience in kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. And it allows us to envision the public student, the student who moves beyond their self-identity and begins to understand the collective identity, that we're all part of our communities no matter what. We use the education system not just as a tool for delivering learning, but actually as a mechanism in democracy to foster democracy in that way that Benjamin Franklin envisioned when he created one of the first public schools in Boston. This draws a whole circle and begins to allow us to see that meaningful involvement is something that isn't just for students. Instead, it's something for everybody all throughout every one of our communities. It isn't just an opportunity for equality, it's an opportunity for pure, real, and authentic equity. And it moves beyond what schools have been and takes them towards what they could be. And that's a little bit about meaningful student involvement.